Hello, Aries. Wow, the energy of this reading is really interesting. It feels like someone is slowly waking up to feelings they've been trying to ignore for quite some time. And honestly, some of you may have already sensed that. It's almost as if this person is finding it harder and harder to turn their back on this connection. Because the more they reflect on everything, the more they realize that the very thing they once overlooked has become the one thing they can't seem to forget. And I think that's exactly where this reading begins. Let's take a closer look at what's really happening behind this shift, because there's a lot more going on beneath the surface than it may seem. It feels like someone is slowly waking up after spending a long time trying to ignore what they truly feel. And honestly, some of you may have already sensed that. It's almost as if this person is finding it harder and harder to turn their back on this connection. Because the more they look back, the more they realize that the very thing they once took for granted has become the one thing they can't seem to forget. And I think that's exactly where we need to begin. The first thing I'm picking up on here is a very strong energy of observation, not the kind that's obvious. Not the kind where someone suddenly shows up and tells you everything that's been on their mind. This feels more like someone standing at a distance, quietly watching, quietly noticing, paying far more attention to you than you probably realize. Some of you may have felt this for a while, not because they're constantly showing up, but because every now and then you get this feeling that someone still cares, even if they never say a word. The energy suggests this person has spent a lot of time thinking about you. And what's interesting is they're not just replaying memories of moments you shared together. They're thinking about you as a person, the way you speak, the way you move through life, the way you handle challenges without constantly needing validation from everyone around you. It feels like they saw those things before, but they never fully understood them. They noticed them. They just didn't feel the depth behind them. But distance has a way of changing perspective. And the more space there has been between you, the clearer your image has become in their mind. The Star card comes through very strongly here, not because you're trying to shine, not because you're trying to get anyone's attention, but because you don't have to. There's something incredibly natural about your energy, something that makes people feel comfortable when they're close to you, yet somehow unable to forget you once you're gone. And this person is starting to realize that. They're beginning to understand that out of all the relationships, all the encounters, and all the people who've crossed their path, nobody quite feels the way you do. You're not what they're used to. And honestly, that's part of what confused them. This feels like someone who likes control, someone who likes having answers, someone who likes knowing exactly what's coming next. But you never fit neatly into that kind of structure. You made them think. You made them question things. You made them look at life from a different angle. And instead of embracing that, it feels like they pulled back. They created distance. They convinced themselves that this connection wasn't as important as it felt, but time passed. And things didn't unfold the way they expected, because your presence never really left. The conversations stayed with them. The memories stayed with them. Even the feelings they tried so hard to push aside somehow remained. The Page of Swords card appears here as well. This feels like someone trying to understand what's happening inside their own heart. They're observing, paying attention, collecting little pieces of memory. Sometimes it's a social media post, a photo, a random phrase, or just a brief moment that suddenly reminds them of you. It feels like they want to know how you're doing, whether you're happy, whether you still think about them, whether you're still the same person they once knew. And what stands out most is that they're not just attracted to your appearance. They're not focused only on chemistry or attraction. The energy shows something deeper. They're drawn to the strength within you. And that's where the Queen of Wands card comes in. There's a confidence in your energy, not a loud confidence, not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, knowing your worth, knowing what you deserve. And that energy is making this person see you through a completely different lens. It feels like the longer they watch, the more they realize that the one thing they thought they could easily move on from is becoming the thing they think about the most. Because deep down, they're starting to understand that the problem was never really you. And as that realization becomes clearer and clearer, another wave of emotion seems to be rising underneath all these thoughts. A feeling that, honestly, may not be so easy for them to avoid anymore. And it feels like that emotion is exactly what they can no longer keep running from. Because when someone truly stops and takes an honest look at what happened, they often realize that some losses don't show up the day everything ends. They show up later. They show up in the quiet moments. They show up when everything around them finally settles down. They show up when there's nothing left big enough to distract them from their own thoughts. And the energy here suggests this person is moving through a season like that. Some of you may not see it from the outside because they're still trying to appear okay, still going to work, still laughing, still carrying on with life the way they always have. But underneath all of that, something seems to be changing. It feels like they're beginning to look back at their choices from a completely different perspective. The things they once thought weren't that important. The moments they assumed would always be there. The conversations they believed they could return to whenever they wanted. All of it is showing up in their mind now with a very different meaning attached to it. Wow, I'm picking up a strong energy of awakening here. Not the kind that happens in one dramatic moment. Not some sudden lightning strike of realization. It's more like layers of fog slowly lifting. Little by little, day by day, quietly but undeniably. And what's becoming visible behind that fog is a truth they've been avoiding for a very long time. The truth that they hurt someone who genuinely cared about them. The truth that fear, pride, stubbornness, or wounds they never fully healed may have shaped the way they treated you. And what's interesting is that this person doesn't seem as interested in blaming circumstances anymore. They're not as quick to say it was someone else's fault, or that the timing was wrong, or that outside situations got in the way. The energy shows someone beginning to take responsibility for their role in the story. And honestly, that's one of the hardest things a person can do, because a lot of people can walk away. A lot of people can avoid difficult emotions, but not everyone has the courage to look back and ask themselves, what did I do with the person who truly loved me? It feels like that question keeps showing up more and more often in their thoughts. And I have to say, there's a deep sadness surrounding this energy. Not sadness because they're lonely. Not sadness because life didn't go according to plan. This feels more like regret, a very different kind of pain. Because regret often arrives when we finally recognize the value of something after we've already let it slip away. And that's exactly where this person seems to be emotionally. They're remembering the little things, the things they barely paid attention to before. A simple check-in, a thoughtful gesture, a certain look in your eyes. A moment when you stood beside them while the rest of the world seemed to misunderstand them. The things that once felt ordinary have somehow become the things they remember most. The Five of Cups card comes through very clearly here, not just because of loss, but because they're beginning to realize how much energy they gave to things that never truly mattered. Too much focus on worries, on pressure, on fear, on problems that felt urgent at the time. And somewhere along the way, they may have overlooked what was actually meaningful. And once that realization starts settling in, it opens the door to even more questions. There are moments when they stay awake far longer than they should. Moments when they replay different possibilities in their mind, wondering what might have happened if they had handled things differently. If they had been more honest, more mature, less defensive. If they hadn't pushed someone away who only wanted to be close to them. And the more they think about it, the harder it becomes to find peace within themselves. Because what troubles them most isn't simply what was lost. It's knowing they played a part in creating that distance. And that truth is beginning to spark something important inside them. A shift they were never truly ready to face before. A shift that's slowly leading them toward the deepest and most honest emotions they've been carrying all along. And what's interesting is that this person doesn't seem to be looking back only at the relationship anymore. They're looking back at their life as a whole. It feels like for a very long time, they lived by a certain set of rules. Everything had to make sense. Everything had to stay under control. Every decision needed a clear reason behind it. They believed that if they kept enough distance from their emotions, they could avoid getting hurt. If they never allowed anyone too deeply into their private world, they would always be safe. But then someone came along and slowly began to shake the foundation of those beliefs. Not because you were trying to change them. Honestly, it doesn't even feel like you ever asked them to become someone else. You simply showed up as yourself. And somehow, that had a greater impact than any advice, any pressure, or any attempt to convince them of anything. The Tower card comes through very strongly here. And this doesn't feel like destruction in a negative sense. It feels more like an old belief system that no longer fits. The things they once thought were true. The habits they used to protect themselves. The defenses they relied on to avoid facing their emotions. All of it seems to be developing cracks. And the more they try to deny it, the more they realize they can't go back to being the person they used to be. Because something changed after meeting you. It feels like you helped them notice parts of life they had overlooked for years. They're beginning to understand that success isn't everything, control isn't everything, and strength, well, Strength isn't always about hiding how you feel. Sometimes it's about having the courage to admit it. There are moments when they sit alone with their thoughts. Not because they don't have work to do. Not because they don't have goals or responsibilities. But because one simple question keeps showing up in their mind. Why does this person make me feel so much? Why, out of everyone who's crossed my path, is this the one connection that left such a deep mark? And the more they search for answers, the more they realize the issue was never that you were too different. The issue is that they had never allowed themselves to experience a connection this deep before. The energy suggests this person became very comfortable with relationships that felt safe. Relationships that didn't require too much vulnerability. Relationships that didn't force them to face old wounds. Relationships that didn't ask them to grow. But you were different. You were like a mirror. Not the kind that reflects what they wanted to see. The kind that reflects what they needed to see. And honestly, that can be frightening, because some people can face the entire world without hesitation, yet struggle when it comes to facing themselves. And that feels like exactly what's happening inside of them. Instead of continuing to run, they're beginning to observe emotions they once buried very deeply. The fear of rejection, the pain they've carried from the past, the disappointments that made them question love altogether. All of it seems to be rising to the surface, not to hurt them more, but to help them understand themselves more clearly. The King of Cups card comes through very strongly here as well. There's a quiet, emotional maturity beginning to form. It's still cautious, there are still things left unsaid, but it feels like this person no longer wants to keep fighting their own heart. They're starting to understand that emotions aren't weakness. Being sincere isn't weakness. Caring about someone isn't weakness. And as that realization settles in, a much softer energy begins opening within them. Almost like a door that has been locked for years is finally starting to open. That's how the Ace of Cups card appears here, not loudly, not dramatically, not in a rush. Just a growing awareness that they don't want to keep living the way they always have. Because this connection showed them that there are other ways to love, other ways to connect, other beautiful possibilities they once believed they would never find. And as their heart begins to soften after carrying so much armor for so long, another thought seems to be taking shape in their mind. A thought that's no longer centered around what they lost, but around what they want to do with the feelings they can no longer deny. And honestly, I think that's where the real difference begins. Because realizing you've made a mistake is one thing. Being mature enough to do something about it is something entirely different. And the energy suggests this person is stepping into that space now. It doesn't feel like they're satisfied just standing at a distance anymore, watching everything unfold. It doesn't feel like it's enough to keep all of these thoughts locked away inside. In fact, the more they understand the value of this connection, the more responsible they seem to feel for what they've contributed to it. I keep seeing the image of someone slowing down to think, slowing down to reflect, slowing down long enough to understand that if they want to build something meaningful, they can't keep approaching life the same way they always have. The Knight of Pentacles card comes through very clearly here. This isn't impulsive energy. This isn't someone having a realization and immediately rushing forward without thinking. Actually, it's quite the opposite. This feels like someone carefully considering every step. Someone who understands that some wounds can't be healed with a single apology. Some distances don't disappear after one conversation. And because they understand that, they're beginning to think much more seriously about how they want to show up in your life. There's a question that seems to keep repeating itself in their mind. What do I need to do for this person to truly feel the change in me? Not to impress you, not to prove they're perfect, but to show you that they've genuinely learned something from everything that's happened. And what's interesting is that for the first time in a long time, they don't seem completely focused on what they want. Their attention is shifting toward your experience, what you've been through, what you've carried, what you may have needed during those moments when they chose silence or distance instead. And the more they place themselves in your shoes, the more clearly they understand the impact of their past actions. The Temperance card appears here like a calm stream of water. It doesn't create dramatic changes overnight. It doesn't push. It doesn't force anything to happen before it's ready. It feels more like someone learning how to find balance within themselves, learning how to bring the heart and the mind into the same conversation, learning how not to let fear make every decision. And I think they're beginning to understand that maturity isn't about always being right. It's about being willing to look honestly at the things you could have done better, and then choosing differently. Wow, there's something really beautiful about that energy. because it feels like they're no longer trying to win arguments inside their own head. They're looking for peace. They're looking for something more meaningful than being right. And one thing that stands out to me is how often thoughts of the future seem to be appearing now. Not in the form of grand plans, not in the form of fantasy, just simple everyday moments, longer conversations, shared experiences, days where neither person has to wonder what the other is feeling. For the first time, it feels like they're allowing themselves to imagine what it might be like to walk beside someone rather than carrying everything alone. And then the Six of Cups card comes through, bringing a feeling that's incredibly familiar, warm, gentle, sincere. This person seems to be remembering who they were when they were with you, a softer version of themselves, a more relaxed version, a version that wasn't constantly guarding every emotion. You know, sometimes people enter our lives and make us want to become better, not because they ask us to, not because they demand it, but because their presence quietly shows us who we're capable of becoming. And that feels very much like what's happening here. They're not only remembering the relationship, they're remembering themselves. They're remembering the person they used to be when they were close to you. And somehow, that version of themselves feels worth finding again. Not through words, not through big promises, but through actions, steer actions, more thoughtful actions, more mature actions. Because the more they sit with all of this, the more they seem to feel that if this connection truly means what their heart is telling them it means, then maybe it's time to stop standing still and face a much bigger decision than they've been willing to face before. And maybe that's exactly why their heart doesn't want to postpone this any longer. Because the closer they get to this decision, the more they seem to realize that some opportunities in life don't come around very often. Some people pass through our lives and eventually fade into memory. But then there are others who leave such a deep imprint that no matter how much time passes, it's impossible to pretend they never mattered. The energy here suggests this person is getting very close to a point where they no longer want to keep everything locked inside. Not because they're being pressured. Not because someone is pushing them. But because these feelings have been sitting in their heart for a very long time. It feels like they've spent countless hours thinking, reflecting, questioning, wondering whether they should finally take a step forward. And what's interesting is that the fear is still there. I don't get the sense that this is someone who suddenly feels completely confident. Honestly, they seem nervous. Nervous about how you might respond. Nervous about whether things could ever feel the same again. Nervous about whether they'll even have the chance to be heard. But instead of allowing those fears to control them the way they once did, they're beginning to make a different choice. The Fool card comes through very strongly here. It's the image of someone standing in front of a new doorway, not knowing what's waiting on the other side, without guarantees, without certainty, without all the answers, and yet still feeling called to take a step forward. And I think that says a lot about the transformation happening within them, because this feels like someone who used to act only when everything felt safe, only when everything felt certain, only when they believed they could control the outcome. But real emotions don't work that way. Sometimes we have to move forward before we have all the answers. Sometimes we have to tell the truth before we know how it will be received. And it feels like that's the lesson they're learning. I'm also picking up a strong movement from the Eight of Wands card, not chaotic movement, not rushed energy. More like something that has been stuck for a very long time, finally beginning to flow again. Thoughts are no longer staying trapped inside the mind. Feelings are no longer staying locked away inside the heart. Some of you may sense that this person is finding it harder and harder to stay silent, because the longer they hide what they truly feel, the larger the gap becomes between their inner world and the version of themselves they're showing everyone else. And honestly, that's exhausting. It's like carrying around an untold story for miles and miles without ever putting it down. Eventually, a person reaches a point where they simply want to speak the truth, not to change the past, not to erase what happened, but to finally be honest about what's living inside their heart. And that's exactly what feels like it's beginning to form here. The Page of Cups card also carries a very gentle energy. This isn't someone trying to impress you. This isn't someone trying to prove they're stronger, smarter, or better than anyone else. Actually, it feels quite the opposite. It feels like they're learning how to show up with a softer heart, less guarded, less calculated, less focused on hiding what they feel. And yes, that can feel incredibly vulnerable. Because whenever we're honest with someone we care about, there's always the possibility of rejection. There's always the possibility that things won't unfold the way we hope. But it seems this person is beginning to understand that living inside endless silence is far more painful than facing the truth. I keep picking up on words that were never spoken, feelings that were never fully named, thoughts they held back every time something reminded them of you. All of those things are creating a momentum that's slowly guiding them closer to their own truth. And what stands out most isn't the action itself, it's the intention behind it. This doesn't feel impulsive. It doesn't feel competitive. It doesn't feel like someone trying to win. It feels like someone who simply wants you to know that a lot has been happening inside of them, to know that these feelings are real, to know that this period of reflection has changed the way they see many things. And when a person begins choosing honesty over self-protection, another door slowly starts to open, a door connected to a much deeper question, whether they're truly ready to turn these thoughts, these feelings, and this growth into something real. And what I'm feeling here is that this person is standing in a very different place from where they once stood, not because every problem in their life has suddenly disappeared, not because every question has been answered, but because their perspective has changed. It feels like they're no longer looking at this connection through the eyes of self-protection. They're no longer focused only on what could go wrong, no longer looking only at the risks, the differences, or all the reasons things might be difficult. Instead, they seem to be seeing a much bigger picture, a picture they may never have fully allowed themselves to see before. The World card comes through here in a really powerful way, and it carries the feeling of a cycle slowly coming full circle, not to end everything, but to complete a lesson, to complete a chapter of growth within themselves. There are older versions of this person that seem to be falling away, the version that constantly questioned its own feelings, the version that ran whenever things became too deep, the version that tried to control everything instead of trusting what the heart was trying to say. And it feels like they're beginning to understand that some things in life cannot be built through fear. They can't be nurtured through distance. They can't grow through endless silence. And that realization is creating a completely different energy. Honestly, there's a lot of hope here. Not the kind of hope that's built on fantasy. More like the feeling of someone finally recognizing what truly matters to them. Because sometimes life doesn't change because of one major event. Sometimes it changes because of one very simple moment. A moment when we realize we don't want to keep living the same way we've always lived. And it feels like this person is moving through one of those moments right now. And as that happens, the energy of the Sun card begins to shine very clearly. There's something incredibly warm about this energy, almost like someone who's been walking through fog for a long time and is finally beginning to see clearly again, seeing themselves more clearly, seeing their choices more clearly, and seeing you through a very different lens. This doesn't feel like temporary admiration, and it doesn't feel like a passing emotion. It feels like they're finally recognizing qualities in you that they may not have been mature enough to fully appreciate before. Your strength, your patience, your ability to love without trying to control someone else, your ability to keep moving forward even after your heart has been hurt. And the more they reflect on this journey, the more they seem to realize that you've taught them far more than they ever understood at the time. And because of that, thoughts of the future seem to be showing up more clearly in their mind. Not a future built on beautiful promises, but a future built on growth, honesty, presence, and the effort of two people who truly understand the value of a meaningful connection. The Ten of Pentacles card appears here with a very grounded feeling, not rushed, not impulsive, not driven by temporary emotions. It feels more like someone beginning to ask themselves a very important question. What is truly worthy of my time, my heart, and my energy? And as they search for that answer, your image seems to become clearer and clearer. You know, what I love most about this reading isn't the story of regret, and it isn't even the story of realizing a mistake. It's the story of growth that exists underneath all of it. Because sometimes the thing that changes a person's life isn't who they meet. It's who they become because of that meeting. And honestly, that feels like what's happening here. An old chapter is slowly closing within them. A new perspective is opening. A more authentic version of themselves is beginning to emerge. And wherever this journey eventually leads, the energy suggests they're no longer the same person they once were. Because some connections enter our lives for more than just a memory. Sometimes they change the way we love, the way we grow, and the way we understand the true value of a human heart. And Aries, it feels like the biggest message in this reading isn't really about who was right or who was wrong. And it isn't even about what happened in the past. It's about the transformation taking place inside someone as they begin to see life through a more mature heart. Because sometimes we don't truly understand the value of a connection until distance enters the picture. Sometimes it takes a long road, a lot of lessons, a lot of experiences, and a lot of awakenings before someone finally recognizes what genuinely matters to them. And that's what this reading seems to be showing. A journey of realization, a journey of growth, a journey where sincerity is slowly finding its way back to the surface. And wherever your own story happens to be right now, I hope you always remember something important. Your value is not determined by whether someone chooses to stay or chooses to leave. Your value has always existed within you, in the light you carry, in the strength you've built, in the way you've continued to love, grow, and move forward through everything you've experienced. So thank you for spending this time here with me. And if this message gave you something to reflect on, take what resonates with your journey and gently leave the rest behind. You know, you truly matter, and I appreciate every single one of you for being here. I'll see you again in the next reading. Until then, Aries, keep trusting your path and keep shining in the way that only you can. Bye for now.